Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here on a snowy Monday, an unexpectedly snowy Monday. So, thank you for making the effort to come out today. We so appreciate you and are so glad to see you today. So, my name is Heather Miller. I'm an adult programming librarian here at the La Crosse Public Library. If you have any questions or need any accommodations, I'll be in the back of the room. Feel free to come and see me. I'm happy to help. And it is my great honor to introduce today's speaker. Today we have Deanna Springer, and she is the Vice President of Marketing at Nancy Zeman Productions. And she heads up the NZP design team, designing projects for Stitch It Sisters and the new Nancy Zeman Sewing Studio in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. She values her work in partnership with PBS Wisconsin, who are co-producers of Sewing with Nancy, The Best of Sewing with Nancy, and The Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. Deanna has dedicated her career to the art of sewing and quilting and will be sharing insights from this year's event in today's talk, Highlights from the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. Please give Deanna a warm welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Heather, for that wonderful introduction. As Heather mentioned, I'm Deanna Springer from Nancy Zeman Productions in downtown Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. Has anyone visited our store? Yeah, have you been to the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show? Some people? Great. Well, we're going to talk all about the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show that takes place annually in Madison, Wisconsin, and it's always the weekend after Labor Day. So in September, early September, you have Labor Day weekend, and then that Tuesday after Labor Day, we start setting up, we fill our truck, and then we head to Madison early Wednesday morning and set up for the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. And Heather will start the broadcast. Thank you, Heather. So ask questions along the way. There are a lot of different facets to the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show and many different features that we'll talk about. So feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. I'll repeat your question and then we'll share with the group. So let's get started. This is the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show, the Central Quilt Exhibit, and it's our 20th year. This September, September 2024, marked our 20th annual Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. And we started the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show, an idea by our founder, Nancy Zeman. Has anyone watched Sewing with Nancy? Yes, yes, Sewing with Nancy fans in the audience. So we co-produced Sewing with Nancy, The Best of Sewing with Nancy, and the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show with PBS Wisconsin, headquarters right in downtown Madison, Wisconsin, on the University of Wisconsin campus. So that's where we recorded Sewing with Nancy, and that's where we meet monthly to talk about the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. So Nancy had the idea in 2005 to start a quilt show. If you're familiar with public television, do we have public television supporters here? Yes. Outreach and education is the mission, very much aligning with the library's mission to provide quality programming. So Sewing with Nancy has been on for over 40 years. 40 years. Nancy started Sewing with Nancy in 1984. It's 2024. So we've had many great years of now reruns because we lost our founder. If you're not aware, we did lose our founder, Nancy Zeman, in 2017 to 2 major cancers. But she created an amazing legacy. The Great Wisconsin Quilt Show is one of her many gifts to our community. And PBS Wisconsin partners with us, and it's a fundraising event. It's an amazing quilt show plus a fundraising event. So Nancy Zeman, our founder. Here's a shot of the Central Quilt Exhibit in the center of the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. There are over 300 quilts in this main exhibit. This is a 10-category juried and judged quilt exhibit. So right now we launched the 2025 entry form, and there are 10 different categories you can enter a quilt into, from wall hangings to bed size, from hand quilted. That's right, category 1 is entirely made with a sewing needle and thread, not sewing machine at all. We have the largest bed size hand quilted category anywhere in the United States. And I'm told that also internationally, we have a huge showing here in Wisconsin of hand quilted, entirely pieced and quilted by sewing machine needle, hand needle. So pretty amazing. As you enter through the different categories, you'll see bed quilts, wall quilts, and then all different types of techniques. There are many different techniques when you make a quilt. From traditional piecing, many of us know if you have antique quilts, those are traditionally pieced, to applique quilts. We'll talk about applique quilts. I have some pictures. And I think we have a bunch of quilters in the audience, right? So many of you know what I'm talking about. And the local Quilt Guild has an ongoing exhibit here at the local La Crosse Public Library that is amazing. And I hear you change it out quarterly. So come and take a look and visit the La Crosse Public Library to see a quilt exhibit. Whenever you're wanting to see some quilts, just come on to the library. Come on over to the library. The first quilt show started in 2005. Again, Nancy Zeman, our founder, is on the right, and that's her quilting friend, Natalie Sewell. Natalie Sewell taught Nancy how to landscape quilt. What is a landscape quilt? They are hanging on to one of the pieces they had in the works that first year in 2005, and it's a pictorial quilt made of many, many different little bits of fabric. So if you know Art 101, if you're making a painting or a piece of artwork, you start with a background. So Nancy always chose a hand-dyed background that would represent her landscape. And then she worked from the background forward, adding tree trunks, cutting little bits of leaf fabric, and then she glued them on with glue stick. That's right. Nancy was a renegade quilter. No one was using glue sticks in quilting, and I'm talking school glue sticks, right? Elmer's glue sticks, that's right. There was a lot of, oh, Nancy, what are you doing? Well, that's the technique that Natalie taught her. And they were longtime friends, and they had a standing Friday quilt date. Nancy would go to Natalie's home in Madison, and they would do Friday quilting all day long, and of course, get some really good lunch. You know, go out to lunch or brought into lunch. So both of them are award-winning quilters, and this is just one category of quilt, the landscape quilt, pictorial quilt. There are Nancy and Natalie. And this was a photo taken for their book, the first book that they did together. And our landscape, the Best of Landscape Quilting book is in reprint, and it will be out this spring. So we're bringing back reprinting their best-selling landscape quilt book. So you have that to look forward to coming up this spring. I just love this photo here. It's a beautiful landscape quilt. And if you look at the quilting borders, look at those trees. They burst out of the seam onto the border, like 3D coming out off the quilt and around in front of the frame. And that's just little bits of fabric. We have Nancy's original, very first landscape quilt on exhibit at our store in downtown Beaver Dam. So in downtown Beaver Dam is the Nancy Zeman Sewing Studio and Quilt Shop. And the second floor, there's a history exhibit about Nancy. So you can learn all about the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show and things we're talking about today. Plus you can see her very first landscape quilt. It's called Tiffany Mountains, and you can study it. I mean, you can get this close to it. And you can see all the little bits of leaf fabric and tree fabric. And if it didn't have the exact shadow or shape she wanted, she used markers, Sharpie markers on quilts. That's right, glue sticks and Sharpie markers. And they used a lot of pastels, you know, the chalk pastels that you could do art drawings with. So that's really the foundation of the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. And we knew if we had, you know, if we wanted to create a quilt show in Wisconsin, we had to loop in Claudine Hansen. Claudine Hansen was a Sun Prairie, lived in Sun Prairie, and she was a nationally known, actually internationally known quilt teacher, quilter, award-winning quilter, and she actually is the creator of the modern day quilt show. So the quilt shows that happen at Paducah, Kentucky, the EQS show, she founded that show. She taught them how to create a quilt show. We know, many of us know maybe quilts in our county fair, and then sometimes our counties will have different quilt shows. We took it to the next level and created the large exhibition quilt show in Madison. So we looped in Claudine and a couple of other nationally known quilters that were from Wisconsin, like Diane Gaudinsky. Diane Gaudinsky joined our first few meetings. I'm the last founding member of the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show, that board that we started in 2003. along with John Muskowski from PBS Wisconsin. We're the last two founding members around. I had to look back, to put this presentation together. And 2005 was our premiere quilt show. That's the year we launched the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. And we had the University of Wisconsin marching band members there and Bucky Badger. And to create our 20th anniversary, we looked back over the years and we brought them back. So they were back in September at the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show, and you can see the videos of the marching band and Bucky Badger entertaining the crowd. Now, you can't get that anywhere else other than Wisconsin, right? In 2005, when we premiered the show, one of the facets was a kids quilting challenge. Forever and ever, we always involved children, kids, with sewing and quilting in our, the entire business. Nancy started her first business in 1979, and we had an annual sewing weekend event in May. Has anyone attended that in Beaver Dam, our annual May event? We're still doing it in downtown Beaver Dam. And as part of our May event, our sewing event each May, we had a kids sewing challenge. So when we created the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show, we knew the kids had to be a part of it. They're the next generation to carry on quilting and sewing. We, in 2006, well, let's back up a little bit. In 2005, we had our first Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. We had 1,200 people registered. And Nancy said to me, Deanna, I'm a little nervous. That's not very many people. We told PBS Wisconsin that we were going to create this wonderful quilt show that thousands of people will come to, and it's a fundraiser for PBS Wisconsin. We don't want to disappoint them. Well, we did the best we could do. We launched it, tons of public media. PBS Wisconsin does all of the promotion, provides the volunteers, and Nancy Ziemer Productions in Beaver Dam, we coordinate all of the quilts and schedule all of the education, the teachers. So we held our breath and we drove over to Madison in 2005. And I ran into Nancy. She was down in the sewing, in the atrium where we did charity sewing events. And she was teaching Bucky Badger how to sew a quilt. And I was in the front of the show, launching the show. We met in the hallway and I grabbed her arm. I'm like, Nancy, it's working, it's working. I scared the dickens out of her, but it was working. Even though 1,200 people pre-registered, 11,000 people came that very first year. Yeah, amazing. It's working, Nancy, it's working. From then on, it's grown. So in 2006, it was our second year, and we always wanted to add a special, something new to each year. So we added quilt appraisals. We listened to you, quilt show attendees. What do you want to see at the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show? And one of the comments was, quilt appraisals. We want to bring our quilts to Quilt Show and have you appraise them. So we hired Carol Butsky, and she came and started doing quilt appraisals in 2006. Looking back, I thought it would be much later, but we really launched a lot in the first couple years. Also in 2006, we took over the entire exhibition hall at the Alliant Energy Center in Madison. The first year, we had probably 3/4 of it. The next year, very next year in 2006, we took over every square inch of that building, including the conference room where we did quilt appraisals. In 2009, we hosted Kick It Up a Stitch as an evening event. We always have evening events at the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. People, move down to Madison, take over the hotels, and they want something to do at night. So we have evening events. And in 2009, we offered the Kick It Up a Stitch. You can watch this at nancyzieman.com. Kick It Up a Stitch is kind of a Lucy and Ethel take on sewing and quilting. And Mary Malari on the left is Nancy's most frequent guest on Sewing with Nancy. Mary has been on over 50 times on Sewing with Nancy. So it's really fun. They work really well together. They're both Scandinavian, so there's a lot of little joking going back and forth. And again, go take a look at that today at nancyzieman.com. Just search Kick It Up a Stitch. And also at nancyzieman.com, you can watch episodes of Sewing with Nancy. So there's plenty to do at nancyzieman.com. It's hilarious. You'll laugh out loud. In 2010, we got a picture with Nancy and me and our two biggest fans of the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. This is Debbie and Janet. Debbie and Janet have been to every single quilt show, the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show in Madison, since the beginning. Looking back, this is the only picture I could find of us together. They were always the first in line for every event, every night event. So I got to know them over the years. I would rely on seeing them first in line. If they weren't there, I'd wonder if something was up. But Debbie and Janet, still our biggest fans, have still come to every show. It's a family reunion, really. It's all of us getting back together once a year. People that enjoy quilt making quilts. And we have a lot of people come to the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show just to look at the works of art. These aren't your grandmother's bed quilts. These are amazing works of art. This is Nancy and Lucas, her puppy dog Lucas, the family dog. In 2011, we started the Quilt to Give community service event. So every year at the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show since 2011, we sit and sew quilts for charity in the atrium. So the atrium is an area where you have lunch, and then it's also surrounded by classrooms where you can do sit and sews, hands-on education. You can sit and sew and make a quilt and learn new techniques. So we gather in that atrium area and we make quilts every year. Not just lap quilts. We are making twin size bed quilts for individuals and families in need. So you just sit and sew for 10, 20, 30 minutes, help us cut out fabrics, or just donate fabrics. You have some fabrics in your stash that you don't want anymore, bring them to Quilt Show and donate them, and we'll make them into quilts to donate to families and individual in needs. So that we started in 2011. In 2015, we took Sewing with Nancy on the road to the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show, as if we were not busy enough hosting and producing the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. Nancy said, let's do a live episode of Sewing with Nancy at the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. So you can watch this episode. It's called The Great Sewing Bee, and it's at nancyzeman.com. And she'll go from vendor booths to the stage presentations, the sit and sews, the special quilt exhibits. This year in 2015, we had a yurt. We had a yurt come in, and a yurt, as you may know, is a traveling tent that would, house people at night as they would travel. But this is a yurt that's filled with quilts on the outside and inside. So you want to watch this show. It's called The Great Sewing Bee, The Great Quilting Bee, at nancyzeman.com to see that yurt. That's something we should have back again. We haven't had that since 2015. So every year you can see we're adding something new. So in 2016, we created a quilt challenge. So in the central quilt exhibit, that 10 category juried and judged quilt show were those works of art. That's a little bit intimidating. If you're a beginning quilter, you think, oh, maybe I can't enter a quilt into that central quilt exhibit. But you can sew a 30-inch by 40-inch, so 30-inch wide by 40-inch long. Every year we have a different theme. And this was our most popular theme. This represents the Black and White +1 Quilt Challenge. And I think that was in 2016. We did, our first one was Fall Leaves. And then in 2016, we did Black and White +1. Now, what does that mean? Black and white +1. You have to use black and white fabrics plus one other color. Guess what color this quilt maker chose? Yellow. So pretty spectacular. Quilt Challenge is a great place to try quilting or a great place to try a new technique. We talked about traditionally pieced quilts. This is an art quilt. This is applique. It's kind of like Nancy's landscape quilts, where you start with a background and you work forward. This is all fabric, and it looks like a Mini Cooper. Pretty amazing what you can do with fabric. This is 2016. We're still in 2016 here. So this is our first year we threw up our selfie wall. People wanted to take pictures with one another. We wanted to capture the moment, so we created this selfie wall. And it was actually like a magazine cover. If the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show had a magazine, this was the cover. So you could be the cover girls for the day or the cover people for the day and take a selfie. So this is the last photo we have of Nancy and Natalie. Right after this, Nancy got her terminal diagnosis. And then Nancy passed away in November 2017. And then the next July, we lost Natalie. So they're amazing quilters that contributed so much to the quilting world. We're forever grateful to Natalie and Nancy. In 2016, we also created a new facet. Again, something new every year. We created the Modern Mini Quilt Challenge. It's because of the quilt show attendees. We won a category for mini quilts. Now, mini quilts can be 24 inches or smaller. We've seen quilts the size of postcards entered into the Modern Mini Quilt Challenge. The Modern Mini Quilt Challenge takes place each May. So annually in May since 2016, you follow Quilt Show online on Facebook, Instagram, social media, or just go to quiltshow.com in May. You can learn about the Modern Mini Quilt Challenge. It's a challenge put out to you, the quilters, to say, hey, make a quilt 24 inches by 24 inches or smaller. It could be any shape or size, but it must be made from fabric, and it must be quilted through 3 layers. A quilt challenge and a quilt contest, usually, there are rules that you have to follow. And the quilt sandwich, is made up of a quilt top, a quilt batting, the stuffing in the middle, the batting, and then a quilt backing. So those 3 layers must be stitched through either by hand or by a sewing machine. That's what makes up a quilt. So each year in September at the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show, we hang the Modern Mini quilts. So many of the suggestions were, oh, I wish we had 2 quilt shows a year. Well, there's no way we can do that. It's a huge undertaking to produce the quilt show annually. We've started working on the 2025 Great Wisconsin Quilt Show even before the 2024 quilt show took place. So it takes many months to do that. So to bring the community back together, we hold this Modern Mini Quilt Challenge in May. So start thinking now for what quilt you want to make for the Mod Mini Challenge, because it will be announced in May. Remember, 24 inches or smaller, any shape or size. This is one of our quilt challenges. Each year we launch, remember the black and white +1? Every year we change up the theme. So this year, this was 2018, and the theme was Winter Games. The Winter Olympics were taking place. So we kind of look ahead to figure out the theme. We look ahead to what's happening in that next calendar year for big events or undertakings. And we also change it up. So this was Winter Games. That's really a pictorial quilt challenge. Pictorial quilts. You could do traditional piecing, and you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 quilts in. That's some traditional piecing and then some applique on top. So you will still see mixed media quilts in the challenge. But when we do a challenge like Winter Games, you see more pictorial quilts. When we do a theme for the challenge, black and white +1, you'll see a lot of pictorial quilts, a lot of applique quilts. We kind of rotate every other year. We'll have a log cabin quilt challenge one year. This year, for the 20th anniversary, we brought back that black and white +1 quilt challenge because it was the most popular quilt challenge ever. So this year, quilters made black and white +1 quilts again, and we had more quilts than the first year in 2016. So out of this world. And then those challenge quilts travel for 2 years. They hit the road and travel for 2 years across the country. And then after 2 years, they get shipped back to the quilters, to the quilt makers. There's my sister Dana. In 2018, Dana joined Nancy Zeman Productions. And a few months after that, we created the Stitch It Sisters. So we now have a YouTube series, youtube.com/StitchItSisters, where we continue teaching Nancy's easy sewing methods, her easy quilting methods, and how you can make sewing and quilting fun. Nancy threw all the original rules out the window that we were taught in home ec and she did flat, easy construction methods that are not the traditional methods. From setting in a seam to doing quilt binding, she changed all the rules, broke all the rules. So Dana, my sister Dana, and now my sister Denise have joined us in 2020, and we are the three Stitch It sisters. So this is 2019. This is a shot of the vendor mall. We have over 250 vendors that come and sell products, notions, tools, quilting fabrics, quilting batting, anything you need to make a quilt, sewing machines, long arm quilting machines, anything you need. It's the once a year you can come to Madison each September and you can buy everything you need for quilt making in one stop shop. So vendors come from across the country, and you'll see it says 2019 in person. We didn't really use those words until after 2019, right? The pandemic. Remember the pandemic? Kind of changed everything. It did do many good things too. It brought a lot of us online that weren't before. Remember, we started using Zoom. That's how we stayed in touch with our families and grandkids. We went online. So we did become more digital over the pandemic. And what we did at PBS Wisconsin and the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show, we took the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show online because we could not hold it in person, in 2020. So we took it online. And we did the virtual Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. Now, other quilt shows tried this across the country and the globe, and it wasn't so successful, excuse me. We were successful with the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show virtually because of PBS Wisconsin. Yeah, right? They know how to do video. They know how to broadcast. It worked. Wasn't ideal, but it worked. We came together online as a community in 2019 in September, and we did the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. And we thought, no worries, we'll be back next year. Also in 2020, PBS Wisconsin produced Nancy Zeman Extraordinary Grace. This is a film, a biography about Nancy and all of her life experiences, challenges, how she created her businesses, created the Sewing with Nancy television show. Has anyone watched Extraordinary Grace on PBS Wisconsin? Yes, it's an incredible film. Just search PBS Wisconsin Extraordinary Grace and find out more information about it and watch it if you can. And maybe they still even have some DVDs available. Incredible, incredible film about, my friend Nancy. I worked with her for 27 years before she passed away. So she was like a big sister to me. She taught me everything I know about running a small business and so much more. This is Grant Fenster. I love that they grabbed this photo. When they were producing Extraordinary Grace at PBS Wisconsin, this was in the studio. We met with Grace several times, with Grant Fenster several times, and he collected Nancy's first sewing notions and her 4-H samples of how she did her demonstration of putting on a facing and a waistband on a skirt. And he came to the house, the Zeman home, and he collected her landscape quilts. So in the background, you can see Nancy's landscape quilts hanging, hovering in the air in the studio at PBS Wisconsin. And I love that someone thought to grab this photo of Grant as he's admiring Nancy's work in putting the film together. Now, Grant Fenster, his mom, Cindy Fenster, is a quilter and a quilt teacher. So first, full circle, Cindy Fenster has taught at the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. 2020, now 2021. Guess what? We're still virtual. Ugh. Right? So we did our best job and made our virtual Great Wisconsin Quilt Show bigger and better than the year before. We really knew what we were doing then. And by then, I could come into the studio and host it online virtually. I was the only one in there without a mask on. Everyone else had to be in separate rooms, in separate studios, And there I was, solo in the studio, talking to you through the camera, through the monitor, and not seeing you and not seeing any other people. So it was isolating, but we did it in 2021. Guess what? 2022, we're back in person at the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. You enjoyed the online interaction, the online interviews with the teachers and presenters and quilters, so we kept that going. So we added a new feature to the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show in 2022. So now I roam around the vendor floor, the education rooms, and I interview different quilt makers, vendors, volunteers, everything, everyone, every part of putting the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show together. So you can watch all of these interviews from the past couple years at quiltshow.com or on the Quilt Show Facebook page or on the PBS Wisconsin YouTube channel. Our new selfie wall has become very popular. So you can take your own pictures or volunteer will take pictures for you. And it's a community. Really, Quilt Show is about education, outreach, teaching people how to quilt, keeping the love of quilting going, but it's really about the community and seeing all of you once a year and coming together and enjoying your love of quilt making or your appreciation of quilts with everyone else that enjoys that as well. This is a shot of the vendor mall in 2023. So right inside the front door, you can see PBS Wisconsin on the left there. They're right inside the front door of the show. This is the vendor floor. PBS Wisconsin, and then right next to PBS Wisconsin, the vendor booth in the front. That is our booth, the Nancy Zeman Sewing Studio vendor booth, where we sell fabrics and sewing machines and notions and quilting supplies and books and Nancy's books, Sewing with Nancy books, and all the latest innovative tools. Plus, we're surrounded by 250 other vendors that specialize in different things, in different fabrics and different threads. Yes, there are probably 100 different threads that you could use in quilting, from shiny to metallic to traditional. You learn all about the new products in that vendor mall and seeing those vendor demos. Look what's behind our booth. That's the Central Quilt exhibit. That aisle and aisle and aisle and aisle, those aisles of black drape, that's where the Central Quilt contest is. 10 categories, juried and judged. Over $10,000 in cash prizes are given away each year for those award-winning quilts within that exhibit. Now on the front, the very front of the black curtain, you can see smaller quilts. That's where the quilt challenge is hung, those 30-inch wide by 40-inch long quilts. And then mod minis. You can see actually the mod minis hanging behind our booth, kind of in the middle of the photo. And then to the right of the photo, behind our booth on the black drape, are the kids' challenge quilts. So all of the quilts are there. There are more exhibits in the east-west corridor, or the back entrance, the east-west corridor. There are quilts everywhere. We bring nearly 1,000 quilts to the show each year, and then the vendors bring quilts too. So you won't turn a corner without seeing a quilt at Quilt Show. Here's a close-up. We could not do the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show without 500 volunteers. It takes 500 volunteer, and now more, 500 plus volunteer positions to put the quilt show on. Thanks to PBS Wisconsin and their broad volunteer base, we can do it with their help. And you all have the chance to volunteer too. You can go to quiltshow.com/volunteer and you get to choose. Maybe you want to do a sit job where you stamp hands or take tickets, or you can be inside the quilt exhibit wearing the white gloves. Only the quilt docents wearing white gloves can touch the quilts, right? So she's only touching the quilt because she has the badge that says so, and she has her gloves on. So she'll tell the story about this quilt that she's standing in front of. And many times within the quilt exhibit, you'll meet the quilt maker. They're very proud of their quilt. It's an honor to have a quilt accepted and hung at the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. So many times you're roaming the aisles of the quilt exhibit and you'll run into the quilt maker. And she'll be, or he'll be, or they will be answering questions about their quilt and what inspired them to make it and what pattern they used. Or was it a completely original thought that they had of their own design? Here's another close-up of a volunteer, plus she's a quilt maker. This is Anne. She enters a quilt each year, and she makes pictorial quilts of different scenes like Venice. If she travels on vacation, she takes pictures. She comes home and she makes a pictorial quilt of her vacation. In 2024, we created the event guide. So we're now caught up to this September. We created a full color quilt guide. Every year since the beginning, we handed out a free event guide when you walked in the front door, but it was always newsprint. This year, we took it to the next level, and it's like a magazine. So a full publication, a gorgeous publication of the quilt show and everything that you can see at the quilt show. And of course, you can always find it at quiltshow.com. This is a close-up of the best of show that won. This quilt won the Central Quilt category contest. So out of those 10 categories, there are prize winners in each of those 10 categories. And then there's a quilt chosen that is best of show. And there's also a viewer's choice chosen. You, the viewer, can cast your vote as you walk through and vote for your viewer's choice quilt. The only rule is your viewer's choice quilt cannot have a ribbon hanging on it because it already won an award, right? This is a photo of Nancy's landscape quilt exhibit that we had for our 20th year. And so in September, when you came to the quilt show, this was right between our booth and PBS Wisconsin's booth. And it was all of Nancy's quilts from her home. So Nancy framed her favorite quilts. Not all of her quilts are framed, but her favorite quilts, she paid to have them framed, and then they hung in her house, and they still hang in the Zeman home. The Zeman properties, or excuse me, the Zeman family own all of Nancy's quilts, and some of her favorites you can see framed. So all of those were, stripped off the walls at the Zeman home and were on display for 3 days at the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. And Richard Zeman, Nancy's husband, and his friends brought them to Quilt Show. So we didn't have to have that on our plate. Look at this. You know what is this? This is a quilt challenge that was put out this year. Black and white +1. Amazing. So these are the quilts that will be traveling online. This is just one of 80 quilts that was entered. Amazing. And look at the quilt ID tag on the right of the quilt. Every quilt within the challenge, within the special exhibit, within the Central Quilt Show, all have a quilt ID tag to tell you the story, the quilt maker, and even the person that quilted. Sometimes the person that makes the quilt top is not the person that quilts it into the sandwich. So both quilt makers have their name recognized on the quilt tag. This is Bonnie LeBeau. We have probably 8 different special exhibits come in from across the country. And Bonnie brought in her star quilts. So this is Align Yourself with the Stars. Her star quilts, she's from South Dakota. In her Native American heritage, she told the story of why star quilts are so important. So when we bring in a special quilt exhibit and we bring in the quilt maker, they also do a lecture, an educational lecture. So Bonnie was one of our featured guests this year. This is a shot of our sit and sew classroom. So these are Bernina sewing machines. Each of the sewing machine companies sponsors a different sit and sew room. And they provide 25 sewing machines per room. So you sit, you sew, yeah, wow. You learn a technique, whether it's binding or paper piecing or traditional quilting. We have, I think over 80 teachers come in to teach sit and sew lectures, stage presentations, hands-on workshops. We take over the hotel meeting rooms within the area too, because we've maxed out the exhibition hall at the Alliant Energy Center. Oh, look at who was here this year. Clifford. Clifford was here for the 20th anniversary, and Clifford, the big red dog, is a PBS Wisconsin show. So what other quilt show could bring Clifford in to congratulate the Kids Quilt Challenge winners as they walked across the stage? So it was the first year we had Clifford. So again, always looking for something new and fun each year. This is a shot of the vendor mall this year. We've maxed out the space again. We are back. We had over 19,000 people come to Quilt Show this fall. We're expecting over 20,000 in 2025. There's the selfie wall. You can take your own selfie or we'll take your photo for you. It's a really popular thing. And that selfie wall is right next to the PBS Wisconsin booth. This is just one vendor that sells fabrics and patterns to make quilts. It's so colorful. I love this photo. And in the vendor mall, you'll see the latest products that make sewing and quilting easy and fun. You know, it's all about the right tools that make your quilting projects a success. So you'll see the latest technology. And here I like this shot of the 10 category quilt contest. Again, over $10,000 in prizes. $1,000 are given away in each of the 10 categories. I had to put this one in there for the La Crosse Public Library, right? Yes. This is more traditionally pieced. We've seen a lot of applique quilts and pictorial quilts. This is more traditionally pieced, yet it does have crossover into applique. And this is the best of show winner in the entire show this year at the 2024 show. It's amazing. This quilt maker makes a quilt or two every year. And we'll look at this story. This is the Eyes of the Forest. It did win the best of show. It was in the machine quilted mixed wall quilts category. So there were 10 categories like we talked about. She was the best, you know, this was the best quilt in the entire show. You know, the judging team, I'm not on the judging team, but the judging team decides this. And the quilt maker is Margaret Solomon Gunn from Gorham, Maine, right? And her artist statement, made from hand-dyed silk radiance, that's a brand of fabric, silk radiance fabric, and bold modern prints. She fussy cut the hexes. That's what quilters called hexagons. She fussy cut the hexes to create the flowers on the silk forest, on the forest. Silk applique vines made the lush forest floor. Look closely and you may see something looking back at you. You'd have to study it and see. So it's a work of art. And the craftsmanship that, could you see it? No? The viewer's interpretation. But look at her different flower bouquets that she made from hexagons. Before this quilt was selected as the best of show winner, we already decided in June what our quilt challenge would be. Our challenge for the 2025 quilt show, you know, the 30-inch by 40-inch quilt challenge is hexagons. So you have a year to figure out, almost a year, to figure out, to enter by June 30th, your quilt into the main quilt show or into the quilt challenge. And all of the information on entering quilts and everything we talked about today, you can find at quiltshow.com. And of course, we couldn't do any of this without the volunteers. So we thank the volunteers, over 500 volunteers for putting on the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. And you can just head over to quiltshow.com and see everything we talked about today. See the gallery of quilts. You can click through and look at every quilt that is a winning quilt from the quilt show. And I'm happy to take questions now too. Any questions about the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show? Yes. Do we have a history of quilting display at the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show? We currently do not, sir, but I like your thinking. Yes, there are museums, like quilt museums, yes. There's a International Quilt Museum in Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska, which I've been to, and there's one in Paducah, Kentucky, which I've been to. There's also one in Texas, near Houston. And of course, in Wisconsin here, we have the Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts in Cedarbrook. But I like that. It just gave me an idea for 2025. Yes, he deals in antiques and quilts, and he's seen quilts on the Antique Roadshow. Yeah. Yes, that would be a great idea. Any other questions or ideas? Yes. Do we have a category for piece clothing? We currently do not, but I like that idea too. We have had several exhibits of quilted garments. Why don't you stand up so we can take a look? This is a quilted jacket. Did you make your quilted jacket? Your sister did. Yes. So yes, you could make quilted garments. Thank you for that. It's been a few years since we've done an exhibit, so we should do that again. I know people I can share your ideas with. Is mine printed? Yes. This is from Land's End. I thought I should wear this today, not only because of the snow, but because it's quilty. So when I got the Land's End catalog a couple years ago and this was in there, I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to get this because it's a quilted design. And I expected to see many other quilters wearing this, and I have seen quilters wearing this. Good question. I did not make this, but I could have. Yes. Yeah, she's suggesting another category would be table runners. Um, Table runners are many times quilted. And right now, what we're looking at, my presentation, I don't do a PowerPoint. I create everything I teach on the blog. So see the logo in the upper left corner, the Nancy Zeman blog? You click on that, it takes you to all of our blog postings, if we have internet, there we go. And you'll see many, many, many tutorials, nancyzeman.com/blog, all kinds of tutorials. And in September, October, we do a Christmas stocking table, or excuse me, a Christmas stocking challenge in November. And in October, we do a table runner sewing challenge. So we do a table runner sewing challenge once a year annually. We also do a kids sewing challenge in September. So nancyzeman.com/blog. You can find that. But I like that. It's time to do a wearable art garment and a table runner challenge again. Any other questions? Yes. Are these copyrighted, he's asking. So are these tutorials copyrighted? You may print them and use them for educational purposes or to make your project, but surely you can't, print in mass quantities and sell. But yes, each tutorial, let's just look at this one, the Dresden poinsettia table topper, which is a really popular one. That's actually a quilt block. And we show you step by step, the internet's loading here. We show you step by step what materials you need, what fabric you need, what supplies we used. We always pre-treat our fabrics with spray starch. We tell you the cutting directions to make each project. And then we go step by step, the Nancy Zeman way, showing you how, yes, starting to see how it comes together. Many wedges are cut and then they're stitched and they're pressed, press and sew and press and sew. And then using those right tools to make turning easy and things like that. And then when you get down to the bottom of the post, there's a place where you can click print this PDF. So it will save it as a PDF and then you can print that. Some people print them and put them in a 3-ring binder, but they'll always be here. You don't have to print. Many people don't have printers anymore. And then many times we have a video for each project too. So the Stitch It Sisters video, we teach you step by step how to make these projects. Education, teaching the Nancy Zeman way. Good questions. Any other questions before we wrap up today? Go ahead. Are the winning quilts posted anywhere? Yes. Go to quiltshow.com and then you scroll down. And then you can see, here's where you can enter in the middle, enter the 2025. You can become a vendor. You can put in a teaching proposal. And as you scroll down, oh yeah, you can still buy t-shirts if we still have them available. You can also buy the 20th anniversary pin, which is gorgeous. I should have worn that today. And then you can click on the quilt contest. There's a menu down below. There's a menu up above, and everywhere in between. And then click on quilt contest. And then scroll down. Here's how you enter next year's contest, challenge, kids contest. You can print out the entry forms or submit it online. And near the bottom here, 2024 winners and exhibitors. So you can view and download a list, a printed list that we handed out at the quilt show. Oh, there you go. Or you can view right here the winning gallery. And I think because we're streaming, the internet is a little slow, so it won't be this slow at home if you're not streaming live. So here you go. Here are the winning quilts. The title of the quilt, the category they were in. So you saw the winning quilt. Here's a really fun one. So this is called Fans, and it won second prize, in the bed-size pieced machine quilted. And when you click on it, it'll open a new image of a larger image of the photo for you to read more about it. Great questions. Yes. What was the smallest quilt entered into the central quilt category, central contest? 24 by 24. Can't be any smaller than that. So that's when we created the Mod Mini quilt. And I see quilts into that are as small as a postcard, like 4 by 6, with little 1-inch piecing. Have you ever seen that? Like a bookmark made from quilting? Do you want to know what the secret to that is? You have to be crazy. The secret is instead of, you cut a larger piece of fabric and then take a large seam allowance. You need if you're sewing by sewing machine, their feed dogs need something to grab onto. Yes. Yeah. Yep. Start with big pieces and take large seam allowances to make small miniature piecing. Mm-hmm. Yes. You see the fan quilt has a lot of names, yes. Guilds and quilt groups can enter a quilt. Each quilt maker can enter up to 4 quilts in the central quilt contest. Different categories, only 1 per category, up to 4 quilts. But if you have a quilting group, that quilting group can enter quilts into up to 4. And then a jury meets each June and juries the photos. So by actually June 30th, you submit your photos and entry forms, and in July, the jury meets, and I'm not on the jury. I can't be swayed. But then the jury accepts or rejects. Not every quilt entered makes it into the show. Nancy could never be on the jury because she always wanted every quilt to be entered. Good questions. Yes. Amish quilters participate in the show? Sure thing. The quilt contest is the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. Quilt contest is open to every quilt maker, all inclusive. Every quilt maker can certainly enter the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show contest. Yes.
Fortunately, this last year, 2024, could not find a bus from La Crosse to Madison to see the show.
Her comment is, unfortunately, she could not find a bus group that was going from La Crosse to the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show in Madison. Bus tours are very popular that are brought, from all over the state and actually out of state to Madison each year at the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. It's getting more difficult. You need to fill the bus to be able to pay the bus company and the bus driver and mostly the fuel. The fuel costs have really prohibited some of the smaller quilt shops from hosting because it's a big gamble. But you should encourage your quilt shops and your guilds to look into it. It's not, you're not stuck. If you don't fill the tour, you don't have to go through it. Every tour company is different, but they should give it a try. And you can always contact us. Go to quiltshow.com and click on Contact Us. We'll find you a close bus somewhere that's coming to Madison. Great comment. Thank you. Okay. The comment was the La Crosse Park and Rec Department usually hosts a tour bus that comes to Madison each year to the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. Hopefully they'll do it again. We'll get in touch with them, encourage them to do that again. Yes. Otherwise, there are quilt shops around the state and quilt guilds around the state that do have tours that we can get you to a closer destination. Leave the driving to the tour company. Yes. You're so tired. There's so much to do all day long. You can go for 3 days. And usually the last day and the last afternoon, I would say to Nancy, let's just go one more day. We're all set up. Let's go one more day. And she's like, forget it. So, yeah. And I was joking, of course. It's a lot of work. Yeah, I can do, 20,000 steps a day there. Yeah. Great feedback, great questions. I thank you for coming today. And thank you for your interest in the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show.